Program mode. We're going to move up from auto mode of shooting to a new exposure mode. It's called program. So let's get started. First, before we get too far into the technical stuff, let's just take a moment, take a deep breath, and smell the roses, whether they're natural or silk like these were. We've covered quite a bit so far, and we're only in our second module of the first course. Wow. As we move from course to course, you're going to be building on your knowledge, adding to that foundation that you're building right now, and keep growing in your skills and creative abilities. So I encourage you to take some time, review the lessons that you've already covered, and remember at this stage, the most important thing is to get comfortable with that camera and get comfortable with the idea that you're going to take control of it. It's not going to control you. And you're also going to control the pictures that you're making so that they really come out like you want them to, not like somebody who designed the camera and the computer systems and so forth wants them to. But don't pressure yourself too much. Do enough work to gain the confidence that you need, gain the knowledge that you need, and then act on it. Okay, back to work. We've mentioned a number of different exposure modes in previous lessons. We've been describing the different capabilities of the camera, and some of that I quite understand might be sort of gobbledygook, as we call it, but we're going to get down to using these things more and more, and they'll become more clear to you. You've already made some photographs using the auto mode. You know what MAPS stands for, right? M-A-P-S, manual, aperture priority, program, and shutter priority. They're all different exposure modes, settings that determine how the camera will function to make a successful picture for you. Now, if you're participating in the assignments and the peer reviews, which I hope you are, you've already made a picture and shared it with your fellow learners and gotten some feedback using the auto exposure mode. Remember, with auto, the camera makes all the decisions, and that includes focus. What we were doing in that assignment was getting out and trying to express what it is that's important to us without worrying too much about technique. We're going to work with program mode now, which is a little bit different. In program mode, that's the P mode, the photographer takes on a bit more responsibility. You'll remember that in auto, the camera did everything: focus, ISO, even if the flash was going to be used, total. In program, the only thing the camera does is determine the aperture and the shutter speed, and it sets those based on information that you give it, and you can control the rest of the operations. You can control focus, ISO, and so forth. Even though the camera is not controlling as much in auto, there's a preference to its settings that you should know about. You can think of the program mode as being sort of the anti-camera shake mode. It's also sometimes the shallow focus mode. Let me explain. In situations where the light is dim, or you have set your ISO very low, remember the ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor to light, program mode will set the widest aperture so that a faster shutter speed can be used. In this situation, I was photographing 3 small ceramic figurines in a dimly lit dining room cabinet that also contained some stemware, some glasses. I set my ISO very high at 12,800 with this little camera, so the sensor would not need a lot of light for a proper exposure. The program mode set the aperture at its widest, f4. Even at that extremely high ISO setting and the widest aperture, the fastest shutter speed I could use was 1/60th of a second. Now, that was fast enough so that any shakiness I might have had in my hand wasn't going to be an issue, but it's not a very, very fast shutter speed. Next, I changed the ISO way down to 100. The sensor now needs a lot more light to properly expose it in the same lighting situation. Remember that the lower the ISO number, the more light is needed. The program mode still selected that widest aperture, f4, big wide hole, but because the light was so dim, the fastest shutter speed it could use was 1/2 second. That's a long time. That's a very slow shutter speed. And obviously my hand was shaking a little bit. The closer you're focusing, or the longer the focal length of the lens, the more you've zoomed out or zoomed in, the more blur you're going to get with even the slightest movement. For this photograph, I photographed the silk roses in the same lighting conditions as the figurines. This one again with a very high ISO of 12,800 so that I could use a shutter speed fast enough to freeze the image and avoid camera shake. This would have been a good choice if I was photographing a person or a pet also, not only to avoid blur from my movement, but also from any that they might make. For this photograph, I moved the roses outside on a chilly winter day in Michigan, and they were placed in an open shaded area. The ISO for this picture was set again at 100, just like the first picture I made indoors of the flowers. The program mode still favors, remember, the faster shutter speed, so it's going to use the wider aperture, in this case again f4, to allow the most light possible to enter the camera. And the shutter speed for this picture was 1/160th of a second, a bit faster than indoors. Changing the ISO to 6400 made the sensor much more sensitive to light. And in this case, program mode shifted a little bit in terms of its preferences for shutter speed and aperture. It determined that at 1/1250th of a second, there would be no blur from camera shake. Okay? And even though it could have selected a faster shutter speed on the camera to use that widest aperture setting again, f4, it allowed a smaller aperture to be used to increase the depth of field. What's depth of field? Well, depth of field is the area within which things are reasonably in focus. Program mode is first and foremost designed to avoid camera shake blur. But at higher light levels and higher ISO settings, it'll also create greater focus areas. While depth of field is a concept we will address in another lecture, referring to that focus area, you can see from this picture how much sharper the foliage is in the background. So remember, program mode is going to first favor a faster shutter speed. And you can control the appearance of the picture in terms of blur or sharpness from camera shake or subject shake simply by changing the ISO. The higher ISO setting, you're going to have a faster shutter speed and sometimes an aperture that's set a little bit smaller to give you greater focus distance. The lower ISO setting, on the other hand, will still often result in a fast shutter speed, but almost always a wider aperture. So you'll have shallower depth of field or shallower focus area. The lower ISO setting, of course, can also result in a blur from camera movement or from subject movement, but you know something? Sometimes as a creative person, you actually want to work with that blur and play with it and enjoy it as a creative expression.